We don't know whether she's here. Has she been in contact with?
We have her recording anyway.
Yes. But we don't know whether she's online.
No, I wrote to her.
Okay, so this will be a surprise. We'll deal with it. I think it should.
No,
be.
yes,
No?
no. So we have.
There's one person online.
Ankita. Okay,
Excellent.
that's excellent. So we can, okay, talking
Very
about her. Then we have 2 minutes.
We've just been talking about her because we didn't know that actually.
She was supposed to present in person,
Okay.
but now she's not here.
But she's online.
That's also good. Maybe she has COVID.
Yeah, many people, right?
Yeah, then maybe she has COVID. You never know because now.
You don't know.
So many infections, but we have 5 to 10 incidents.
Yeah.
Now it's going crazy. It's going crazy again.
Surprise, surprise.
You're surprised they lifted all the measures? Yeah.
Okay, I think we
What
have
did they expect?
1 minute and then we can start.
What did they expect? But Veronica could come online and watch it.
Yeah, of course. She can do that.
I call her.
So, a minute. And then.
Du kannst jetzt aber online gehen und auch zuhören und wenn du das selber willst, dann will ich das machen. Schau doch mal, vielleicht kommst du rein, das wäre doch total nett, dann kannst du eben, wir haben hinten eine Techniker, sitzen.
Okay. Hello, welcome to the presentation. So first of all, I want to give you some announcement related to the plenary session. So we will have the plenary session from 6:15 to 7:15 in the theater saal. So, and after we will have the dinner, just due to the problems we had this morning with the electricity. So welcome to the session ID 43 about scenarios of material stocks, flows, services, and practices, exploring nexus approaches to address climate change, air pollution, and sustainability issues. The organizers is Adriana Gomez, Helmut Haber, and Edgar Hertwig. And we have two collaborators, Jihum and Gamse Unlu as well. So the idea of the session is to focus on approaches to analyze society-nature interactions and analyze their implications on greenhouse gases, air pollution, and sustainability. We have seen that recently, so the scenarios are moving in trying to integrate the materials part, but still they are not quite yet there. So what we want to try to do here is to find out, to start building a community that can provide more detailed information on material demands, resource use, product processing, the services that they are providing, and how this is affecting the climate, and is able also to meet the human needs, so how all these processes are taken into account, and also to bring the concept of the circular economy and all these processes into the scenarios, which is still a bit behind on that respect. So in that respect, so we will invite our first speaker, Stefan Pauli. Please come to.
Thank you, Adriana. Hello, everybody. It's for me a pleasure to be here. I'll try to set things up. And I also try to keep it short. The presentation is much longer for what I've prepared. And while the topic is about timber, the framework used is much broader. So let's see where we are at in terms of materials. Okay. This is the world we have been living in so far and still live today. And we see it with the energy crisis that was created by the Ukraine war. Energy is still scarce. If you look into the longer future, we know that because of the abundance of solar energy, we should at some point live in a world, and we have already first signals. The price of solar PV is plummeting and so on, but we will be constrained by materials. We do not have the construction materials, the sand and the gravel in all world regions, and we are also scarce in critical minerals. So there is, on a longer term, a major shift, and one of the reasons why we have the circular economy is to accommodate for this paradigm shift that is coming. If you zoom a bit in the materials into wood use, we have these more immediate issues, right? We need to change building codes to use more wood. We need to have the sustainability question. Maybe we should rather have the wood in the forests and so on. And we have these larger challenges here. We need to think about material substitution. Where do we use the wood? We need to think about how the performance of wood in building changes if the energy supply changes. We need to think about the question whether the wood may be placed better in the forest, whether we should not just let them grow instead. So this is also a big research stream. And the question how to manage supply demand. The material turnover we have globally is much, much larger, a factor 10 maybe, than the wood that we could ever supply. And we don't live in a bioeconomy anymore. We did this in the agricultural society. So we really have challenges here. We know already that we have this trend towards wooden construction. We know that roughly, on an average, you take out 2.5 tons of concrete, replace it by 1 ton of wood. You have the same functionality in the building across the different wood types, the structural and the shielding. We have much less timber than we would like to have if we wanted to do it all in timber. That means we need all the material efficiency. And just some core facts about wood: its carbon content is about 50% of the dry mass. And if you cut down trees for hardwood, only 30% can actually be used for structural timber. The rest is residues. It doesn't have the right shape and quality. For softwood, it's more than 70%. One of the reasons why the wood industry is so focused on softwood these days. It grows faster and you can process it easier. We have a large and comprehensive framework. We're not doing wood products LCA. We want to understand the social metabolism of wood. We do this in the broad cascade. We have these overall objective of well-being and of climate impacts, so that could also be a conceptual framing for this session. We definitely use it in most of our research. And in between, we have these steps. We have the services provided. They are functioning. The services are provided by the functioning of products, for example, the driving of vehicles. And then we have this stock flow service nexus. So in order to build our products like this building, we need a one-time build-up flow or many build-up flows for the society, and we need to operate and maintain them, renovation materials, energy supply for operation. Then we have the energy carrier, the conversion, and all this links then to the land use for material extraction and the greenhouse gas implications and so on. Why do we need all this detail? First, because the stuff we do, the regulations, the products, they are always linked to a specific step. Building codes here, energy conversion technology there. So this is the detail we need to understand all the different mitigation measures we have. Second point why we need such a detailed framework is every step here offers an opportunity to decouple. We can decouple greenhouse gas from energy supply by renewable energies, but we can also have sufficiency strategies in here by decouple well-being from service consumption. So this is all needed. And if we also manage to organize our material cycles widely, maybe because we have the social, the environmental, and the economic dimension in here, we can talk about sustainability, but it really requires such a broad approach. What we're going to focus in this talk, the short second half, is the technical part of the system, the material cycles, and we're going to start with the red dot, the services. So this is our entry point. So it's not the big question about the well-being, but it's really starting about the services. And just to give you one example here, because this is new data, non-residential building. Right? Residential buildings are covered well by many models. We know the square meters, we have scenarios for it. We also started looking into non-residential building, and there's a striking difference. The US, Canada, and also Germany have more than 20 square meters per person. Buildings like this one here, that's a non-residential building, hospitals, schools, restaurants, offices, shops. India, 0.8 square meter per person. So you see there's a huge, and it's much larger, it's a factor of more than 20 difference. That's a much larger difference than we have for residential buildings. And then we can have convergence scenarios for low demand, modeled after Grübler and colleagues, or SSP1, SSP2, but these are expert-based estimates on how these trajectories in those different countries could evolve. And we will use this combined with lots of material efficiency strategies, longer life, more recycling, all these things that we need in a material cycle model, the so-called REC model, climate change mitigation, resource efficiency. So this is what we call, the freaks call it DMFA, dynamic MFA. So we have all the material flows at each step over the entire cycle, from production, use, recycling. We model their change over time to actually represent the stock flow service nexus. So the materials we have is the actual materials in the new buildings to build the stock that the scenario suggests. Same with the recycling and so on. So the types of results we produce look like this. We have on the left column, blue and green, SSP2, that means basically convergence to levels of rich countries for stocks. Right column, a low demand scenario with less. And then here we have no new climate policy from today, and here we have a 2.0 degrees compatible energy supply. And you see emissions go down. These are the total emissions from this system. Energy supply, material production, use phase, it's all included. Emissions go down, and emissions go down substantially in those two corners, orange and green, so either with low energy demand, low demand, or low carbon energy supply. But if you want to really go low carbon, you need to combine both the supply side measures, low energy carbon supply, and the demand side measures. Both of them need to come together, and then this is now a zoom into these red figures, then you have a near carbon neutral building stock. In the break, we just discussed with Volker how difficult it is to even implement the simplest renovation measures. So this is a very, how to say, broad, big picture scenario. And here we see that there are additional gains to be made from using wood in those materials. Wood-intensive buildings go even lower, and combining them also with material efficiency. So that's the main message here. The wood would help to make the climate, the building sector carbon neutral. So how does it work from an attributional perspective? If you think of forests at the landscape level, they are a big machine that sequesters carbon. They capture it with photosynthesis and they spit out timber. A very simplistic case. So that's what we call a climate neutral or climate sustainable forestry. In our model, we account for the carbon emissions when they actually occur. That's different from LCA, where you combine it all into one timeless indicator. So here we would wait with the carbon emission from the wood until it's actually burned at the end of life. And that gives you timing of emissions that we need to take into account when we calculate the global warming potential using the so-called dynamic characterization factors. So that's now an established method in carbon accounting. That leads to that climate neutral forest timber put into a building, 100-year storage, 100-year time horizon, has a net sequestration of -1. It's still there at the end of the time horizon. Same storage period, 100-year building, but 200-year time gives you still -0.2. So, and since I'm running out of time, I want to show you that we are also factoring in, we need to account for the global supply-demand imbalance. We see here the unmet demand from our wood-intensive buildings in relation to a supply estimate by Radeloff, Johnston and Radeloff, that we have huge unmet potential in Africa and Asia, simply because the urbanization demand is there so large. So there we definitely need to have less wood-aggressive strategies, need to focus more on material efficiency with concrete, whereas in Europe, we can even have more timber because we have a very effective timber industry. The Americas could roughly meet the supply with the demand with the supply they currently have. We also, I don't want to explain this, it's too much, but we can talk about this. When we balance, when we do the carbon accounting for wood, we also need to think about the alternatives. What about letting the forests grow? We have done work on this based on Finnish colleagues. Basically, we need to compare the the harvesting scenario with a letting grow scenario and factor in the decarbonization of the material supply as well. More details we can definitely talk about later. What we see, that when we talk about the buildings, we need to start thinking at the city scale, because it's not only about building fancy buildings with some wood, it's also about having a lower building space. That's what we see in our scenario. We need this for climate neutrality, so we need to start thinking about the city scale, how the building services, residential, non-residential, and transport will be better integrated in the future. So that's definitely the ambition for our scenario work, to learn more about this. There's been a lot of input to this work from the REC team. Edgar is here, but also Fabio, Nico, Peter, and Tomer from the REC team, and also from our group in Freiburg, Christian, who did the consequential wood assessment, and Zaina, who helped with the data compilation. So then I want to thank you. If there's time for a few questions, I'm happy to answer, else we can discuss later. And sorry, it was a bit of a rush, but there's always so much more to explain and talk about. But I hope you got an impression of what is going on.
Yeah, thanks. A lot to unpack here. You mentioned timber demand is higher than timber supply, or likely to be. What type of demand are we talking about here? Is it to substitute partly concrete, and to what extent?
Just because I have the numbers in my head, in Germany we produce 250 million tons of concrete every year. The wood equivalent of this would be 100 million tons, but we have only 10 million tons structural timber. So it's a factor of 10. So not all of the concrete, I mean all the subway stations we won't do in wood, right? It's a bit too wet down there. But you see there's a factor of 10 difference. Okay, but so you're really talking about trying to substitute a maximum amount of concrete, really? That's how you set up your demand? The framing I apply here is exactly not this. But it's happening because now all the architects think that wood timber is fancy. And it's true, Vorarlberg is a front runner in this regard. But timber will be scarce because also of the land use issues. So I think it's really, the perspective should be, let's use the timber we have wisely, meaning long storage, modular, and circular. Not going from the demand side, give me all the timber that you get. So I think it's really, we need to think it from the supply side.
The microphone is behind you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks a lot. I was just wondering, did you also, when doing the assessment, take into account the opportunities to make the incumbents, so the steel and concrete, more environmentally friendly or emission intensive, so CCS on cement, adding slag and whatnot, these types of things? Is this all taken into account?
Not all. But for example, there is hydrogen-based steel making in the scenario. So we use message model hydrogen, put it into the steel manufacturing to decarbonize it. So, and that's why it's also you see the change from the wood use was not so large. And the reason is that partly the material production already decarbonizes. Okay. In our consequential assessment, we have the full range. Little decarbonization of this industry to full carbonization. And there the question is, our forests could be the insurance if we don't meet our climate targets in the industry sector, which are probably the most difficult in terms of investments, because the forest would still offer the sequestration possibility. But we need to talk about land use constraints, how much, and we need to talk about biodiversity, right? This is only focusing on climate.
Okay. Maybe we take one more, and then, yeah,
Thank you, Stefan. Just a couple more questions on your assumptions as all the other ones. So you assume just for new buildings and replacement, I guess. And in terms of the supplier of timber, what sort of timber that is, how fast can it regrow? Let's say if you assume a building lasts 100 years and the trees grow in 20 years, can you produce it 5 times over? So what on the supply side, what was your assumptions around land use and the type of timber and plantations? And yeah,
actually, it's very rough. So far on the supply side, we only refer to this one study because they have a regional supply scenario, and they talk about structural roundwood. So it's trees that are big enough that they can be used, cut into boards and things. There are maybe alternatives like bamboo, for example, that we could glue together. There's also ways of using residues into strand boards for building cladding. So a lot of detail can be added to figure out what else we could do.
Yeah.
But these are rather conservative estimates using only this one category. It's called structural roundwood.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We will move to the next speaker. I think she will present. Do you know if she's going to present online or we will put the recording?
I think she will present online.
Okay. So our next speaker is Ankita Gao, and she will talk about analyzing and predicting the impact of spatial settlement pattern and interdependencies on energy service demands to aid deep mitigation pathway development. Should I put the slides here or she will share the screen?
I don't know what she's going to do. Maybe ask her.
Hi Ankita, can you hear me?
Hello,
I have a recording, so probably she wants us.
Where? Where's the recording?
I think we have it here, no? But this thing doesn't. Yeah, it's here. Probably.
That's her, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we are waiting. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Ankita Gaur and I'm a second year PhD student at the Energy Policy and Modelling Group, UCC, Ireland. I will be talking about the impact of spatial development patterns on energy service demands and how this can help develop mitigation pathways for Ireland. So energy service demands, which are inputs to energy system models, are usually projected exogenously using population and economic growth as drivers. However, there is an increasing agreement in literature that other factors such as settlement pattern behaviors are important drivers of demands that are usually missing. Settlement patterns are one of the main determinants of energy demand and GHG emissions. How spaced out people live affects journey distances, mode choice, and viability of public transport. It also affects the built-up area size and material intensity. Given the lock-in effects of spatial development, sustainable urban planning that reduces energy demand is necessary to combat climate change. We did a literature review of research on urbanization, energy consumption, and emissions. We found that most studies discuss urbanization for developing countries, and the conclusions are very region-specific, and detailed level analysis for each country is needed. We also found from the literature review that most studies only talk about urbanization in terms of population increase, whereas other factors such as built area and income are often missing. Urbanization can have a direct or indirect impact on energy consumption, and that is to say it can lead to higher demand due to increase in quality of life or lower demand due to higher urban efficiency. Higher energy consumption could be offset by technology improvement. The literature also suggests that interaction between government departments is missing, which is very necessary to coordinate urbanization and climate goals. Ireland has a very ambitious climate goal, which is to say that 51% GHG emission reduction by 2030 relative to 2018 and net zero by 2050. Also, the residential and the transport sectors still have fossil fuels in the fuel mix, which makes up to 90% of the fuel mix, and the carbon dioxide intensity of energy supply is still high in Ireland. Also, Ireland is expected to undergo massive urbanization. It's expected to have significant population growth relative to other European countries, and there's a demand of about 28,000 dwellings per annum between 2021 and 2030. And the other challenges include high GHG emissions from agriculture sector, which is very difficult to abate. So energy system has to do the extra work to get to the 2030 target. Also, Ireland has a relatively isolated electricity grid, which makes it very challenging to integrate high shares of renewable electricity. Ireland has a history of dispersed settlement pattern, which has led to high car dependency. As you can see in the graph here, there are still significant houses being built in rural areas. Rural areas mostly have one-off houses that need to be connected via road networks, power supply and water supply, leading to higher material intensity of the built environment. The Census 2016 results show that oil, wheat and peat are still being used as the main central heating fuels in rural areas, which gives rise to high emissions. The infographic here shows the mode share in urban and rural areas. Again, rural areas have high share of private cars as compared to urban areas, because in urban areas there are other mode choices available. The objective of this study is to understand the historical relationship between settlement patterns and energy service demands. We gathered the Korean land cover data from 1990 to 2018 along with some national level statistics. We divided Ireland into 6 regions, that is 5 main cities and the rest of Ireland. These historical trends show that urban expansion has been continuously rising in Ireland. In some cases, built area has increased more than the population. Private cars and dwelling numbers have also been increasing in each of these areas. So these graphs show the importance of planned urbanization in the next decade or so. We did a panel data regression to understand the effects of population, land expansion, and income on energy service demands. It can be seen that population has had the highest impact, while land cover has had some impact. And also I would like to point out that currently the energy service demands for each region are calculated in a top-down manner, and we aim to improve that in the future. We also did an extended Kaya identity to understand the drivers of CO2 emissions in each of these regions, and we used the LMDI method. So we decomposed CO2 emissions for the residential sector and the transport sector in terms of population, share of urban population, income, energy service demands, built area, energy intensity, and carbon dioxide intensity. So this graph shows the decomposition of residential emissions in between 1990 to 2000. The emissions have remained fairly similar. However, in economic growth has contributed significantly to emissions increase, whereas carbon intensity has decreased and dwelling growth hasn't been as much as expected. So that has led to lower emissions. And a similar trend can be seen from 2000 to 2018. However, urbanization in this case has had a positive impact. That is, it has led to lower emissions because of smaller houses and smaller and efficient houses being built in urban areas. Similarly, in the passenger transport, again, economic growth has been one of the major factors related to which has led to higher emissions. In this case, urbanization, energy intensity, between 1990 to 2000 have led to higher emissions, but from 2000 to 2018, urbanization has actually led to lower CO2 emissions. That is, dense development is a positive sign for residential CO2 transport CO2 emissions. And to conclude this presentation, urbanization has led to lower CO2 emissions in the transport and residential sectors. That is because of shorter travel distances and smaller houses. Population, economic growth, and energy intensity have increased CO2 emissions in the past. Hence, planned urbanization is important to offset emission increase due to other factors. The National Planning Framework in Ireland outlines 50% increase in population is expected in major cities. Urbanization has a clustering impact which can reduce energy and CO2 emissions, but quality of life in terms of housing prices and public transport infrastructure must be considered. And future work includes bottom-up estimates of energy service demands at regional level, spatial regressions to predict urban land cover expansion and impact on energy service demands, and use this information to inform mitigation pathways using the Times Ireland model. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your presentation, and maybe, can you hear me? If you can hear me, maybe we can take some questions.
Yeah, I can hear you. Am I audible?
Yes? So
Yeah, okay, great.
there's
Yeah,
some
thank you.
questions for Ankita? Yes, here, please.
Yeah, Edgar Hertwig here from NTNU.
Hi.
Very nice work, but it went past quite quickly, so I didn't quite catch how you could identify urbanization as a contributing factor. And I was also wondering about this implicit assumption of a unit elasticity between the service demand and the GDP.
So right now what we've done is we've used urban land cover as the proxy for urbanization. So urban land cover and urban population, and in future work will be including will sort of include urban income as well, because right now we've used gross national income. So we still have to build on this work, and the aim is to sort of develop maybe SSP style scenarios for Ireland using these information. So this is still in progress, and these are just preliminary results to show that urbanization is actually an important, because Ireland is expecting major urbanization in the next 2 decades. It's important that we plan this ahead. So, yeah.
Any other question? Then if not, maybe we continue with the next presentation. I'm the next presenter, so. So, it's open. Okay. So what I will talk about now is about the waste sector, and what I would like is to highlight the importance of the waste sector in the scenarios, and how this can help to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollution, as well as help with some insights into the circular economy. So first of all, what I would like to show is that the importance of the waste sector into the different discussions that we have now. So we know that the waste sector was overlooked in the COP26, but we are all aware that it's an important sector that will play an important role in the economy-wide decarbonization. And we also know that all reductions of greenhouse gases, most of them can come from the energy sector, but this is just half of the story. So we also need to look at production, extraction of materials, resource use. And now, with the global methane pledge, we know that we have to tackle the three main sectors, and waste is one of the main sectors where the reductions of emissions have to take place. And if we move most to related to the plastic resolution, so we need that this plastic resolution will boost investments in recycling technologies and bioplastic products. So what I want to highlight here is that still, when we looked at the waste sector, we see that we're still losing quite a lot of resources there. But we also are causing quite a bit of air pollution because we still have countries that they don't have implemented well management systems, and therefore open burning of waste is one of the main ways how they manage waste. And of course, we still see some methane emissions from landfills, and of course, we also have health impacts from all these different unmanagement. So what we wanted to look at here is what is the role of the waste sector in terms of reducing greenhouse gases and air pollution, but we also wanted to highlight the importance of including better representation of the waste sector in the integrated assessment models. So what we did, we used the greenhouse gas and air pollution interactions and synergies gains model, and we adopted the shared socioeconomic pathways to develop baselines and mitigation scenarios. So as we all know, so the SSP1 represents kind of sustainability-oriented scenario, the 5, the fossil fuel consumption, and the SSP2, the business as usual, and 3 and 4 are more related to inequality scenarios. So for the MFR, or maximum feasible technical reduction potential scenarios, what we did is we adopted the circular municipal waste management systems, and this means that this includes restrained landfill of waste, increased material recycling and reusing rates, and technological improvements. But in addition, we have in the SSP1 implementation of behavioral measures, such as reduction of food and plastic waste generation. From that, the results shows that the global municipal waste generation will continue increasing in all SSPs, but we also see that the difference between the SSP5 and the SSP1 is just 10% by 2050. However, if we include strategies targeted to reducing of waste, we can actually reduce these differences by 20%, but the waste will continue increase, so we will not reach the peak yet, not even in the sustainability-oriented scenario. These also show that, of course, different kind of narratives will lead to different municipal solid waste generation rates, and these rates will differ, of course, between not just between countries, but also within regions, between urban and rural areas. When we look at the, for example, developed regions like North America and the EU, we see that the different narratives will not really have an impact in terms of the generation rates. But if we move to look into, for example, Africa and India, we see that the different narratives will lead to different waste generation quantities. And this is not just related to generation quantities, but it's also related to the composition of waste and the availability for the different, let's say, composting or recycling and so on. So if we want to know what is happening into the future, we need to know what is happening now in terms of the waste generation. So we see that at global level, 64% of the waste is unmanaged, 36% is managed. Most of the managed waste or the good practices is happening, for example, in the EU28. And if we move to look into India and Africa, we see that even though they have increased the collection rates, the management of waste is still not good, or is not meeting the requirements. And most of the waste is being dumped or openly burned, and then we have all the different emissions, and also marine litter. So if we want to look at how the technology adoption will happen into the different kind of scenarios, I will show here the SSP1. So we see that now, currently, we see that this is if we keep as the business as usual, we see that most of the food waste, for example, is being lost, is scattered, or ending up in dump sites. But if we start adopting measures and reducing waste, we are going to able to close the gap of 10% that could be recovered in 2050 under the current conditions, to a maximum of 98% if we adopt all these technologies of the circular waste management. And this means that we need to go to close a gap of 88% in terms of food waste. Another example can be the plastic waste, in which we will know that the recycling is still playing a tiny bit, but the picture means that most of the plastic waste is also being lost, and therefore the carbon and the energy or the materials that's embedded there. And if we move into the future and we adopt the sustainability-oriented scenario, we see that we can move from a 14% of recycling of plastic into the 76%. This 76% shows the current technologies that we have to probably in the future, if we will have more bioplastics and so on, the recycling levels can be higher, but at the moment, this just considers the policies and the technologies that are right now. So this means that we will need to close a gap of 62% in terms of recovery of plastic. So when we move to the emissions and abatement potentials, and we look at methane, we see that emissions from methane are mostly generated in uncontrolled landfills, and this will bring, if we divert the waste from dump sites, this will bring reductions on methane emissions, but these reductions will not happen immediately because of the methane, it needs some years to form because of the composition, the degradation of the organic carbon, and then we will see the reductions in the future. But we also see that in the sustainability scenario, due to the reduction of food waste plus the improvement or diversion of food waste into landfills, so we will see a reduction of methane already happening in 2030 and being higher in 2050. And this is relevant because the global methane mitigation potential is estimated in 205 teragrams in 2050, and the waste sector can account for 25% of this global potential. And if we move to the emissions of air pollutants, we see that the open burning of waste or combustion processes are the responsible of these emissions. So this means that the reduction of open burning will, of course, proportionally reduce emissions of air pollutants and particulate matter. However, the introduction of this circular waste management system will increase somehow the incineration of waste, because not all waste generated can be recycled. And then we will have some increase in CO2 emissions as well. And this means that the only scenario that will reduce CO2 emissions below baseline is the sustainability scenario, and this is due to the reduction of plastic waste, because we are reducing this fossil carbon fraction. So just to conclude here, I want to highlight that the waste sector needs better representation in the scenarios for the different reasons. So it has a significant potential for the reduction and mitigation of greenhouse gases, but it's also important in the circular economy scenarios because it's a provider of secondary materials, but also energy. And the source is source of energy generation, but the reduction of the CO2 will, of course, depend on the energy mix of each region or country. It also it can provide guidance to long-term waste policies. For example, now that we are talking within this plastic resolution about plastic credits, that can bring some insights on that. Also, we see that it has multiple environmental co-benefits, not just in terms of air pollution and greenhouse gases, but also water pollution. And we are still trying to connect this waste generation with the demand side from the message IX materials. So that's all from my side. Thank you.
Adriana. So, yeah, questions, please. And Edka? No, please.
You have to get
For the online participants, maybe. Thanks a lot. That is very interesting. I'm not sure, maybe you said it and I didn't catch it in the beginning. So how do you achieve these high recycling rates? Does that include current standards and techniques, or does that also include potentially different production techniques where you don't have different types of plastic lumped together? That's the one question. And the second question is, do you include the changes in energy demand so that you maybe need more energy for the recycling, and you have also changes in energy supply from changes in the waste incineration? Is that included?
Well, for the first question, what we have included is the current technologies we have for the recycling. For example, it's just that at the moment we are not reaching the maximum level we could reach with the technologies, for example, for recycling plastic or aluminum or glass. So with the current technologies, we can do much more of what we are doing now. So this is one of the so the current scenario is including actually all the directives and policies that are in place now. And what is needs is how countries will adopt this globally, but with the current technologies that we have. And the second was so we know that actually recycling consumes less energy than producing, in general, producing new products. So because you have all the extraction of materials and the processing and so on. But what we want to do now is to estimate how much energy is generated and compare that by country and how much is the demand and how much the waste sector can contribute to that energy. We have a paper before in which we combine the wastewater and solid waste, industrial and domestic, and we calculated that by 2040 the waste sector can cover 12% of the demand, estimated at 64 hectajoules in 2040. So the waste sector could cover 12% of that demand. Of course, it depends on the country as well, but at that global level is like that. And as I mentioned before, the CO2 reductions as well from the energy will depend on the energy mix of each of the countries.
Yeah, it seems like you're making some very optimistic assumptions here. I mean, I've been recycling or plastic waste for 20 years in Trondheim, and if I talk to the municipality, I mean, they are really trying to recycle this, but the recycling rate of what is actually deposited in the plastic box is around 10%, and they just, what they get is not the clean plastic, and so it cannot be recycled. And so what actually the engineers are investigating is chemical recycling of plastic, or thermal recycling. That means cracking, using it as a raw material instead of coal for further production. And all the life cycle assessments I've seen on that is say it's better to make plastic from natural gas, make virgin plastic and deposit or landfill the plastic waste that you have, then trying to create a chemical or thermal recycling loop. Causes less greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, there are two things, because it also depends the type of plastic you have, one of the things. The second is that now quite a bit still from the plastic production is single-use plastics, and you cannot recycle them, so you have to actually send them to the incineration. But another thing is regarding to the plastic recycling prices. So there is not market for plastic, so it's the prices are too low. So for companies or enterprises, it's cheaper to produce new plastic than recycle the plastic.
The challenge is that it's technically not possible to recycle plastic. A lot of the plastic products we have.
Lot of the, but it's mostly because most of the composition of the plastic and municipal fraction is still single-use plastic. But if you look at the, I think Gamse knows about the different types of plastics, you can still reduce quite a bit. And this is something that I show, that a maximum with the technology we have, you can recover or recycle about 70%, 75% of the plastic, not all plastic, even though if we reduce single-use plastic can be recycled. We will have to create some kind of bioplastics or replace the plastic by other type of components.
Yeah, I think we should kind of not get into a too technical discussion and leave that for the coffee break, but many thanks for the question. Yes, so I should be talking. And you don't move,
yeah, because we will invite Helmut to present his research.
I give the mic back to you. Thanks. And you please help me with getting up the right slides.
I can help you, yeah. I suppose this is not a recording, no? No?
Okay, thanks a lot. No, it doesn't work. Okay. So, yeah, many thanks, and sorry that it's me and not Veronica, but unfortunately Veronica can't be here for health reasons, and so I jumped in and present this. So basically this presentation is very different because it's mostly conceptual. It's not about work we have done, but work we hope to be doing in the next years, with examples from work that we have been doing in the last years. So basically I don't have to tell you too much about what is this here? What happens here? I don't know. That would be where Veronica would be if she would be talking. Okay. Okay, so that's the logo part. You don't need the logos, right? Probably in this room I don't have to explain too much about social metabolism. It's basically a system-level perspective on resource flows from extraction to building up material stocks in artifacts like factories or lorries or roads and stuff, and supply people with products in order to deliver services to them, and then you have all these reuse and recycling flows. And one distinction that has become very prominent in the last years is the distinction between stocks and flows. So stocks are the materials that people or societies have accumulated at a certain point in time, for example, like buildings, like the one we are in now. And we need materials and energy to produce these stocks and also to use them. And first law of thermodynamics, if these stocks are growing all the time, what is happening at the moment, then of course we cannot become very circular. And we will need, and the configuration of these stocks are very important for the flows that we have, because we build up these stocks, but also the qualities and the spatial and spatial structures of these stocks determines the flows that we need to deliver certain services. Now it's becoming a problem. It's not only logos behind. But anyway, so the basic idea here is like you know, Amory Lavin's energy services. People don't need energy. They need the services from energy, like having a comfortable room and so on and so on. So the question is, if we want to get sustainable, we need to kind of reshuffle this whole nexus phenomenon to something where these flows and stocks are compatible with like planetary boundaries, for example. And the question is how we can do this, and especially also the configuration of these stocks. I don't know why these slides keep changing all the time. Probably it's the pre-recorded version with just the sound taken out, perhaps, yeah. So the configuration of these stocks are of course all very important for shaping the way the everyday living of people, the practices that people perform when they go through the day. So these routines of everyday life have to change if we want to change this stock flow practice nexus. And this is something that is very difficult to do. This is also something that cannot be centrally planned. This is something that is very, very much a systemic process where the past activities, the stocks that have been built up, and the institutions that have emerged in these processes have a big influence on these practices. And what we propose, or a conceptual tool that we propose to use here, are agent-based models. And you probably, many of you have heard about these agent-based models. They can have very different qualities. Some of them are very simplistic and stylized definitions of agents. And we, and especially Veronica, have been working with very qualitative and quantitative social science methods to establish agents based on empirical work. So that, for example, and the work that we have been doing is focused on land use and farming. That's where I can show some results. What we want to do in the future is to look at the processes involved in building the large stocks that we have, like the building stocks, the infrastructures, the mobility systems, and all these systems. This is more conceptual. So the basic idea is to have empirically rich representations of the key agents, of the key actors, and couple the agent-based model with a stock flow model, a system dynamic model, where the development of these stocks depends on the decisions of the agents, so that you can really show, again it changes without me interfering, but it seems I'm talking roughly at the speed the presentation is foreseen by Veronica. So this is an example from past work. I have been involved in that a little, so I can say a little bit about that. In this case, there was an agent-based model at the regional level that was coupled with a spatially explicit land use model, which we could do because we had farm level, individual farm level data, and so changes in the decisions of the farms translated into changes in land use, which we could then, with another model where we coupled it with a species distribution model, use to assess the species richness, future species richness, and distinguish the impact of climate change as a direct driver on biodiversity versus land use changes that also, of course, drive biodiversity. And this is in this case just to show what you can do with this kind of models, because we want to relate it with industrial ecology, and this we have not done so far, but in this case you can really have spatially explicit land use scenarios depending on various assumptions on, like for example, I think we had 3 SSPs behind that, and that you have different business usual SSP2, SSP1, SSP5, you get different land uses, and this also gives you different patterns in biodiversity. And then you can assess the relative strengths of the direct influence of climate change on the species richness of this area, which happens to be an LTCR site in Upper Austria, Styria, and Lower Austria at this boundary. So this is more or less the Enns Valley. And you see that the biodiversity patterns strongly depend on the scenarios, both driven by climate change and by land use, and you can discern also these drivers. So this is one of the examples of how you can use this kind of modeling approach. And what we want to do is to apply this to kind of industrial ecology ideas like this stuff that Stefan has presented with buildings and roads and infrastructures as main drivers, and see what, for example, mobility-related practices, how they depend on framework conditions, and so this question where people often say, well, if we could achieve certain changes in behavior, we don't talk about behavior, we talk about practices for good social science related reasons, would change, that we can also ask the question, well, what framework conditions will result in which patterns of practices, and what kind of, for example, mobility choices will then follow from that. So that's the basic idea, and we hope that we will be able to do at least some of that in the next years, depending on funding decisions for projects that we have not even submitted, but which we will submit probably this or next year. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you, Helle. That's really cool. A quick understanding question, the difference between practice and behavior. Can you explain?
Behavior is, well, first of all, behaviorism is something that is very looked at for very good reasons, very critical in the social sciences. Second is a practice is a social phenomenon. So the idea is that the practice is dependent on meaning, the meaning that people ascribe to certain things, their know-how, their ability to work with certain stuff, and the material side, like for example, in order to ride with a bike, you need to have a bike, you need to be able to ride a bike, and probably people will only choose to ride a bike if they want to do it because they, for example, they think it's a good sign to ride a bike and not to go by car. Yeah, so and this is not an individual thing. It depends on the social embeddedness and on the institutional aspects of this. So this makes it much. So the idea is actually that practices exist independent of the individual and recruit practitioners. You kind of turn the whole way of thinking around. Yeah.
Any other?
Yeah, just another understanding question. So I saw you have different patterns of farm decisions according to different SSPs. I was wondering how the farm decisions are affected by different SSP
well,
drivers.
We had. I mean, this was very intensive work where we tried to translate the SSP storylines into parameters that we could then use as framework conditions under which the actors then interact and create certain decisions. And the decision trees of the actors, they are informed by very intensive qualitative and quantitative social science research with, for example, farmers. Yeah? So the agents have decision trees that are empirically rich, founded, yeah? And the SSPs then were translated into framework conditions. Like from the SSP narratives, we derived framework conditions like, for example, certain energy policies, prices in the agricultural sector, and so on, that then influenced the decisions of the agents. Yeah.
One more question was about your plan for the resource use agent-based model. In the farm case, the agents can be farms, and that's more clear, but for resource use...
We need completely different
agents. So there can be many different layers of agents and many different layers.
Yes.
Can you give some examples of...
Well, for example, households, and the question then would be, for example, to have different settlement types in which the households are, different infrastructures, vicinity to good public transit versus vicinity to high quality roads and so on, and patterns of distances, for example, to workplaces or to healthcare institutions, to schooling and so on, that then affect which practices are attractive for certain ways of, for example, getting education, getting health care, getting to your workplace, having social inclusion. This depends on these spatial patterns and also on the infrastructural infrastructures that are available in the, yeah. So how we will implement this, I have no idea.
I think we will take one more and then we move to the other speaker.
Thank you. I'm wondering, like, when you take consideration for agent behavior change, then do you consider the influence between maybe, like, using new technology, maybe start to recycle, or using new waste recycle technology? Will it influence other agent? Like, is there?
Just did not understand. No.
Is there like interaction between, like, maybe new behavior change between the agent? For example, yeah, okay.
The key point of an agent-based model is that there is interaction between the agents. Like, for example, in the farm model, the interaction was through the land, the leasehold market. So the renting out the parcels of land, renting them from others. There were direct interactions between the agents, and so the decisions of the agents depended on what the others did. Yeah? So that's, if you don't have that, you don't need an agent-based model in the end. That's the key point of an agent-based model.
But if there are more people have different behavior, then this will become a trend.
Yes. Okay. Now, the point is, it's not, agents need not be individual people. In the case of this farm model, the farms were the agents. So the farm also had a demography. So there was the farmer, the farm family, how many people, and this is indeed very important for the decisions at the farm. Because, for example, if there's a farmer who is old and who doesn't have a successor, yeah, the decisions will be very different from a young farmer that just started and has a young family and gets 3 kids already. Yeah? So this depends the decisions of the agents. Yes. Yeah? It's not about individuals.
Okay. So
Thanks
Helmut, for your presentation. And then we will welcome Edgar Hedvig for the presentation.
Yes, thank you. It has already been introduced by Stefan that we are working together. And so here I'm actually using the same model that Stefan has introduced. for a project that's called SHAPE that was introduced in the plenary session yesterday, which is trying to come up with 3 different sustainable development pathways, so different approaches to achieving sustainable development. And I'm looking specifically here at the residential building sector, so it is sort of zooming in on a single sector, which still is quite rich, and there's a lot of details to keep track of. So I'm going to talk about that. And the 3 scenarios that have been developed in SHAPE are called economy-driven innovation, residential communities, and managing the global commons, where economy-driven innovation, abbreviated EI, really is sort of based on a very optimistic approach or idea of what we can do with technology and how technology can help us to solve problems. Resilient communities, on the other hand, is sort of trying to come up with a bottom-up version of sustainability where there's a lot of bottom-up decision-making, but there is also the willingness to curtail demand, at least in rich countries. And then the management, the global commons takes the approach that we have a government-driven, global, collective, planned development, and it's sort of a bureaucratic ideal. And Stefan has introduced the ODIM-REC framework that is also used here, where we're trying to, or we are using product cohort models that are driven by service demand, and that basically then calculate both the energy demand and the materials that are needed to build up the building stocks. You're getting the hang of it now by the 3rd presentation that has this stock flow dynamic captured. And of course, these stocks then provide the services, and the energy is needed both to build up the stock and to operate the stock. The service assumptions that we have made for, I'm afraid my figures are quite small for the screen, but is basically, for the buildings, is basically the square meters per person that are available for residential living space. And Arnulf Gröbel is sitting in the back. It's, of course, the low energy demand scenario that was the initial guide for setting those numbers. In this case here, we assume that the resilient communities has in wealthy countries a reduction of residential living space. Managing the commons has a constant residential living space. And the economic innovation scenario has an increase. And in developing contexts, we assume that there is an approach towards those values, so there's some sort of movement towards convergence globally, which is not quite reached by the end of the time period yet. So in Africa, where there is very, very little residential living space now that conforms to our industrial country sort of service understandings, there is the largest, of course, need to catch up. And then we have these, the storylines also go into the question of how we actually can catch up. And so I almost need to look, I'm not even sure whether I need to look at what the RC is here to the left, the resilient communities. So this is the lowest growth of service demand. And there we have a fairly high share of single family buildings, and there's an increase, but not quite as drastic, of the energy efficiency. Under the EI scenario, we have the largest growth, so that means the largest replacement of stock, which also provides an opportunity to have very aggressive energy efficiency implemented in the new stock. And we have a larger share of the residential towers as opposed to the normal multifamily buildings. And in this scenario, it is assumed that sort of there is large cities where the most of the growth occurs. And this gives us very different rates of demand or requirements to construct those buildings. So cement on the left You can see in the middle we have the resilient communities, which is clearly the lowest need for cement, and the EI on the left, economic innovation, with the largest building spaces, also requires most cement, and the other path is in the middle. And for the steel on the lower right-hand side, what you can see is that we have significant secondary steel. So this is from buildings that are being demolished, where we can take the steel out, and it's the sum of the secondary and the primary steel that is then the total steel demand that is required. And in resilient communities in the OECD countries and the EU, we have it in periods that all the steel demand for new steel can be, or for buildings can be serviced by demolished existing buildings. And this, of course, comes with certain emissions. So these are the emissions for operating the buildings, emissions for making the materials, and other emissions that are really in the system, and that involves both the construction of the buildings and the electricity and other energy supply, so the off-site emissions. If we look at the climate baseline scenario and then an RCP 2.6 scenario, and you can see actually in the industrialized countries that just the need to not construct much new building space leads to the fact that there is a drastic reduction of this energy need, of the emissions, and in addition, at the same time, of course, we have the decarbonization of the energy system. And the most drastic difference is Middle East and Africa, or Africa and the Middle East, where we have the largest increase, or the unmet demand of building space, which here would be met around 2040, 2050 through a lot of construction in all the scenarios, and there is not that much material coming back which can be recycled, but this grows over time. So as we move on into the second half of this century, materials actually start coming back from the demolished buildings. And in Asia, what we hear, and it's similar in Latin America, for which I don't have any slides here, we basically see that there is a sort of constant material demand over time in the first decades, and it slightly starts going down, and also that there is more recycling flows here towards the second half of the century. And this is again translated into emission flows. On the left hand, the baseline, on the top, the baseline from Africa and Asia, and on the bottom line, it is the RCP 2.6 scenario. And so it is clear that these developing countries have a catch-up demand for materials. So there's a need for more construction that will result in greenhouse gas emissions also in the future. As in Stefan's presentation, we find that there is a significant opportunity for material efficiency to contribute to climate change mitigation, and that the EI scenario will have to come up with high-tech options to decarbonize material supply in order to also meet the climate goals. All right, thank you.
We will take maybe 2 questions, because we still have some presentations.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm Johannes Morfeldt from Chalmers in Sweden. I was wondering, what level of detail do you have on the current stock and the age of the current stock and how long it will live, and what kind of sources do you use for that?
Right, that's a good question. So we do have quite limited data on that. This is well known that the stock data is not very good. Of course, we have some countries where we have better stock data than other countries, so we usually make these assumptions of similarity, that one country is similar to another country. And the stock is, in Europe we have quite extensive research that has been done by building engineers and architects, where Buildings have been characterized by time period and material composition and energy efficiency in these buildings, and we do utilize all that data, but of course if you go to Africa, there is just much less information there, and so we have some idea of what the building stock is today, but the history of the building stock is not very well understood. There is much less archetype models out there that actually describe the archetypes that exist in these regions, and so part of what we're doing here, these are preliminary results, is that we are building new archetypes that actually describe the residential houses in different regions, and they tend to be very different. I had a really eye-opening experience when we looked at Saudi Arabia, where you usually have 2 living rooms, one for the ladies and one for the men, and separate entrances, and an outhouse where the maid lives, and sort of this is a typical residential unit, right? And so much larger families than we have, and so you need to, or you can take those things into consideration. But I think the main things are still captured by just working with these square meters per person. All right.
Yeah, I think we need to move to the next one. And then, thanks for the presentation. So we will welcome Antoine Teixeira.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Antoine Teixeira. I'm a PhD student at CIRED in Paris. And in this presentation, I will describe our work I made with my supervisor, Julien Lefebvre, which is about the carbon footprint of materials as a blind spot of national low carbon strategies based on this case study on France. So first, a national net zero emission strategy is spreading following the Paris climate agreements, in particular in developed countries. They aim to reach carbon neutrality by mid-century by renewing existing infrastructures and equipments in key sectors of the economy, such as energy supply, transport, building, and so on. But the problem is they are built on direct territorial emissions, so they don't tackle explicitly indirect imported emissions, mainly composed for France of manufacturing goods, but also base carbon-intensive materials embedded in capital goods and in imports. So in that respect, there is a risk to overshoot Paris Climate Agreement. And in the current study, we investigate the 3 questions written there. So first of all, what is the contribution of material supplies to current carbon footprint in France? Then we'll have a look of the ability of national net zero emission to reduce the current carbon footprint. And then we will propose some public policy levers to reach carbon neutrality by mid-century. So to answer this question, we developed an hybrid input-output model named MatMat. So in particular, it includes capital flow matrix, enabling to track the link between investments, material demand, and GHG emission. We transpose the existing method of hypothetical extraction method used by Edgar-Helvig to isolate the contribution of materials to the carbon footprint of France. And we develop as well a framework to perform static analysis of the current economy, but as well prospective analysis by 2050. So here on the slide, I describe how we build scenarios. It consists of building a technical pathway under macroeconomic consistency. And in our case, we built two contrasted scenarios. First one is a current policy scenario, which is basically an NDC scenario worldwide, in France and abroad. And we built also a counterfactual scenario, including additional domestic policy to reach carbon neutrality in France by 2050. It is mainly about a change in energy service demand, investment in low carbon infrastructure and equipments, and energy efficiency gains. So on this slide, we first compare in 2015 two contrasting perspectives to measure GHG emission. On the right-hand side, there is direct territorial emission. This is the perspective used by governments to build their strategies. And on the right-hand side, there is the carbon footprint, which accounts for the total GHG emission embodied in the domestic final demand. So now let's walk through through these figures. So the colored part from purple to yellow represent the absolute contribution of material to GHG emissions. The light blue colored part is the contribution of non-material economy. And the black crosses represent the contribution of material in percentages. So the key message here is when you look on direct territorial emissions, material supplies does not appear as a particular issue to reach carbon neutrality. So actually, it only accounts for 55 megatons of CO2, and it's around 70% of direct territorial emission, excluding agriculture that we didn't take into account in our study. And on the contrary, looking at the carbon footprint, material supply appear more prominent. It accounts for 200 megatons of CO2, and which is around 3 tons per capita, which is quite huge because actually in France, I think now it's like 9-10 tons per capita of the carbon footprint. And a key message as well about carbon footprint is it concerns each key final good and services, durable goods, transport of passengers, services, and housing. Now I will go through directly to the measure of carbon footprint by 2050. So here we compare absolute change in the carbon footprint from 2015 to 2050 between the current policy scenario on the left and the net zero emission strategy on the right. So about the bar plots, so it's quite the same thing than before. And we had some stuff about like the blue arrow to give the decrease of emission per sector. And the red star represents the target to reach net zero emission, the reduction that is needed. And so the important results here is that the net zero emission strategy in France only reduced the carbon footprint by 40% compared to the current policy scenario. And actually, it barely reduced the contribution of materials, as you can see here on the top, because the current policy mainly focuses on direct territorial emissions, which is mainly non-material economy in France, based on service. So to sum up the key messages of our study, we have seen that the carbon footprint of materials in France should be a main concern of national sustainable strategy. However, it is currently a blind spot of the current strategy that is claimed to be sustainable. And we propose 3 kinds of policy, public policy action to put net zero emission on track to sustainability regarding climate change. So first, we recommend to implement border policy supporting imports of clean industrial products. Second, we suggest to foster low energy demand policy. Indeed, decreasing energy demand should reduce the demand for materials and investments. And third, the third option is about the work we are working on is about circular economy. So we are looking on the potential strategy, closing the supply chain strategy of circular economy, such as recycling and reindustrialization, to catalyze both reindustrialization in France and carbon footprint neutrality. So that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you. It's a nice overview. I had some questions on your policies. I'm not sure whether we can bring up the slide again because there were 3 dot points and I had very quick questions on all 3 of them. You had border policy. I think, I don't know the details, but I think the EU has a border tax policy on dirty products from abroad. And would your policy proposition be in line with that? Could France join that, or is France further ahead than the EU? What's the situation there on border tax adjustments? And the last one was, I think, relocating industries. I didn't quite understand what you meant by relocating them. You mean physically changing place, and what was that? And the third one I have forgotten, but maybe that's enough.
So on the first, the 3 policy messages we gave is about, I didn't have time to present it, but we represent emission from abroad producer to final consumer in France, and we had a look on the emission passing through the borders. And this policy message is from this analysis. So I did not go through so much the first one. So obviously it's like with some policies such as carbon tax border, but it has to be in France at the European scale, so it was difficult to implement right now. Mm-hmm. And what about the relocating? So it's an idea to, we imported a lot of goods, infrastructure and equipment in France since the last decades. Currently it's considered as waste, so we put it as a landfill. How we recycle it, and the idea will be to use it to produce new goods and to have a less destructive economy. And in this way, we can substitute a secondary product produced in France and increase the production and the consumption of secondary products produced domestically and decrease the new imported goods.
Okay, so it's building up domestic manufacturing capability to recycle.
Exactly.
So thanks a lot for your presentation.
Thank you.
And then we are moving to our last short presentation from Kimon Keramidas. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for allowing me to briefly present this this poster of mine that you can no longer see here because they took them off, but it is available online. So yeah, my name is Kimon Keramidas. I repair drive. No, I don't want to repair drive. Let's see. There it is. I suppose it is. So can we?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my name is Kimon Keramidas. I work at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and this presents work I'm doing at the University of Grenoble. So yeah, I work in energy mitigation studies, and what I'm trying to do is bring the energy system modeling that I'm using, poles, closer together with concepts of industrial ecology. So I'm adding materials to an already existing energy system model. So it's again, a stocks flow approach, kind of. I'm starting from all the underlying activity indicators already present in the model, buildings, stock with square meters per capita, road vehicles with PKM, TKM that need to be satisfied, the road network size, power generation per technology, and I'm using these as a basis to derive annual demand for steel and cement per use and per country, which I can then use to derive standing stocks of these materials per country. And then I'm looking at various issues related to recycling or resource efficiency or material substitution that you can see here. So all of this is on the material demand side, and of course I'm doing also the material production side, so the industrial processes to produce steel and cement. I'm not presenting this in detail here. There is only these gray lines of emissions in a low carbon scenario for producing steel and cement that you can see here. And finally, I'm looking at further broader trade-offs related to these materials. So what happens to land use on if we substitute cement with timber, or what happens to land use if we need to produce hydrogen with electrolysis, for instance. So yeah, I invite you to have a look at this poster as well, and open for questions later. Thanks.
Okay, so that was our final presentation. Maybe we have one question left if someone has a question for one of the speakers. If not, so thanks a lot for attending, and please keep in touch, and we will see what we can improve for the scenarios and the narratives. Thanks a lot.